Our second speaker today is Andy Lemann, and he has a lot of credentials in how to build small and live really well. He knows about sustainability. And just because you're making something small doesn't mean that it can't be a wonderful space in which to live. And as we think about the downsizing that we always mean to get around to and don't quite, the declutter and the simplification of our lives, and we think, oh, we'll live in somewhere smaller, it can be great. So let's hear from Andy about how to do that really well. Thanks, Andy.
All right, well, I've been asked to talk about my favourite subject, design principles for passive energy efficient homes. If we just look at energy efficiency, that's easy. We can do that. But obviously that's not something you can live in, right? So when we're talking about homes, we have to also consider safety, health, comfort, durability, and affordability. And when I'm talking affordability, I mean both to build and to live in, which the live-in part is usually ignored. And when people talk about affordable housing, oftentimes it's not very energy efficient. So it tends to be costly to live in. When we consider all of those things, obviously it's a lot more complicated than just building an esky. So I'm going to talk about a couple of passive design strategies. One of them is called passive solar design, and the other one is called the Passivhaus Standard. And these are two very different things that are often confused, and hopefully I'll be able to help clear up some of that confusion today. So I'll start with talking about passive solar design. Passive solar design basically works off the principle that in the wintertime, the midday sun is low in the sky, and in the summertime, the midday sun is high in the sky. So with that basic knowledge, there's a number of principles that you can use to help to make a home that meets all of those goals: healthy, safe, comfortable, durable, energy efficient. So the house in the picture here, this is actually the house that I live in with my wife. Built this house 10 years ago, and we've been living in it for most of the last 10 years. It's a granny flat in Mittagong on a property that my mother owns. And I can tell you from personal experience that living in a small, well-designed home it's a real delight. We love this home. And it's only 57 square meters, but we feel like it's way more than we actually need. It feels really comfortable to live in. So the first principle down at the bottom there, and these are the principles that are written on the sheet that was on your chair. So I'll go through those quite quickly. So orientation. So to get the best out of a passive solar design, you want to have the long axis of the house running east-west, which then gives you the most amount of north-facing wall, because the north side is where the sun's coming from. Then the windows, as you can see in this example, the side of the house that we're looking at here is the north side of the house, which, by the way, this house has become to be known as the Greenie Flat. And there's a website, greenieflat.com.au, if you want to see more information about this place. So we're looking at the north side, and you can see that the largest windows are on the north side of the house. So the placement of windows is important. And you'll also notice on the west side, which is to the right of this picture, very, very small windows on the west. That's quite important too, because the west side is where you're going to get the hot afternoon sun that can overheat the building in the summertime. So the nice thing about passive solar design is that it works to keep the house warm in winter and cool in summer. And the way it does that, the principal way it does that, is with the amount of roof overhang on the north side of the building. So because the winter sun is low, so this is a computer image of the Greenie Flat. So this is actually the summer image. So because the summer sun is high, if you have the right amount of roof overhang on the north side of the building, it completely shades the north wall, including the windows. So no sun comes in. Helps keep the place cool in summer. And in the winter, when the sun's low, with the right amount of roof overhang, you can see the windows are in full sun. The sun comes back to more than halfway through the building, and so it keeps the house nice and warm in the wintertime. Now, going back to this picture, you might have noticed that there's a narrow veranda running right along the front of the granny flat. Now, this is something that I would never do by choice. I would never put a veranda along the north side of a passive solar house because it's too much roof overhang. But this was a council requirement in the site where the granny flat is. It's a heritage conservation area. Anyway, for one reason or another, they required us to put a veranda along there. So what we did, and you can kind of see it in this picture, was we made half of the veranda roof clear polycarbonate and half of it is corrugated metal. If it was all solid roof, it'd be too much shade for certain times of the year. So the better situation for verandas and things like carports and garages is to put them on the east or the west sides of the building. This is a little design that I was just playing around with, sort of based on the granny flat, but putting a veranda on the east side with a nice little sort of outdoor heating area, and then a carport on the west side. And what they do is that they then provide a lot of shade in the early morning and the late afternoon in summer. But in the wintertime, the sun actually, if this was, say, the north wall of the house, the sun actually rises and sets to the north of east and west in the wintertime. So in this situation, the sun can still get into those spaces in the winter, and in the summer, it actually rises and sets to the south of east and west. And so those walls would be shaded in the summertime. So verandas and carports and garages on the east or west ends is a good idea. The next principle is where you put the rooms in the house. Now, obviously, when you've got the north wall with the big windows, it makes sense to put the rooms that are used during the day on the north side of the building. So things like an office, living, dining, kitchen areas, rooms that are used at night or seldom, like bathrooms, laundries, and bedrooms, can go on the south side of the house. And that way you're making the best use of the natural light that's coming in by nature of the placement of the windows. This one is not on the sheet because I had to fit everything onto one page and there wasn't room for this, but it is an important aspect of passive solar design. So it's a thing called thermal mass. Now, what thermal mass is heavy materials like concrete or masonry on the inside of the building. And this is important because when you've got all that sun coming in wintertime and warming up the space, you need to have way to store that heat so that it'll help keep the building warm at night. So thermal mass concrete, or it could be done with like brick walls inside the building or stone walls. That then helps to store that heat during the day and helps to keep the building warm at night. If you didn't have any thermal mass in a building like this, there's a good chance that it would get too hot during the daytime because there's nothing to absorb that extra heat, and then get too cold at night because there's nothing to release the heat back into the air in the house. So thermal mass is important, but it's very key thing is that it has to be on the inside of the insulation layer, which brings me to the point about external materials. Now, in my opinion, in Australia, it makes no sense to put heavy materials on the outside of a building. So things like brick veneer and tile roofs really don't make a lot of sense in what is essentially a warm to hot climate in Australia. What they do is that they end up storing heat, especially in the summertime. They store all the heat on the outside of the building, which basically just keeps the building hot late into the evening after the sun goes down. So I advocate for light-colored and lightweight materials on the outside of the building. Light-colored so that it reflects more of the sun's heat, and then lightweight so that once the sun goes off it, it cools down quickly and doesn't just keep heating the building at night. The next thing on the list is air sealing. So what you're looking at there is a picture of a thing called a blower door test, which is a way of testing the air tightness of the house. Obviously, it doesn't matter how much insulation you put around a building. If you haven't sealed the air leaks, the insulation does no good. So insulation has to work in conjunction with good air sealing. Insulation, I think we all understand. Now, going back to the air sealing thing, if you make a building quite airtight, you then have to consider ventilation, both natural ventilation, in this case, what's called cross ventilation. So it's to do with the placement of the openable windows so that you can actually get ventilation through rooms. It's an important thing in bedrooms, for example, where the doors are often kept closed at night. If you have natural ventilation, but you also have to consider mechanical ventilation, particularly in a well-sealed building, you really have to think about getting excess humidity out of the building. So things like bathroom exhaust fans, range hoods. A dryer actually acts as a fan, well, assuming that it is actually blowing air out of the house. I've seen lots of places where the dryer is just blowing that hot, humid air back into the house, which is not a good idea. In fact, any of these exhaust fans, it's very important that they are ducted right to the outside of the building, not up into the attic, because you can get mold and nasty things going on in the attic if you do that. And under the new version of the construction code, all exhaust fans have to be ducted to the outside of the building. Or the final option with ventilation, and this is the bee's knees of ventilation, is mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, which basically gives you a constant supply of fresh air without losing the heat. It takes the heat out of the air that's going out of the building and puts it into the air that's coming in. They're a little pricey, but in a really well-sealed home, they're kind of essential in terms of maintaining the energy efficiency and the healthy environment inside the building. So where are we at? Next thing is landscaping. So in terms of passive solar design, the landscaping, obviously you don't want to be blocking the sun, but you can also use landscaping to help improve a site. For example, let's say this house was sitting on top of a hill where there was cold winds coming from the southwest in the wintertime and hot afternoon sun coming from the west and the southwest in the summertime. You might consider doing something a bit like that, say a windbreak on the south and west sides of the building that would help to divert the winds around the building, and also would allow the winter sun, if you place them just right, you can let that winter sun, remember I said it sets to the north of west, so you can let the winter sun in and still provide shade in the summer. So that's an example of how you can use landscaping to improve a site that's maybe not perfect. What you don't want to do is something like that. And I have seen this done with passive solar houses where they planted a little row of sweet little pine trees across the north side of the house, and 30 years later, they got no sun at all. So next thing on this list is solar panels. On the Greenie flat, we have solar panels on the garage and a solar water heater on the roof of the house, which leaves plenty of space for us to add more solar as required in the future. We're thinking about electric vehicles and other things that we might want to add more solar for. We've got plenty of roof space left for that. If you don't have a garage, then you might just put the solar panels right on the roof of the house. In terms of home size, which is the next thing on the list, I like what I call the modified KISS rule, which I think the original is the keep it simple, stupid, but I like the keep it small and simple. So this whole forum is about small homes, tiny houses and granny flats. So that part goes without saying, but the simple part of it, I'm talking about the basic shape of the building. In terms of affordability and keeping costs down, the simpler the shape, the easier and more affordable it's going to be to build. And then you might be able to put some money, by simplifying the shape of the building, you might have some more money that you can put into better windows or some of the other aspects, or a heat recovery ventilation system, or some of the other things that add cost. So the pros of passive solar design: it's effective, and I can vouch for that, having lived in one for the last 10 years. It's very comfortable and it's very cost effective, both to build, because with passive solar design, you're not really adding anything that wouldn't be there. You're just rearranging things slightly differently. You're orienting the house the right way, putting the windows in the right place, putting the rooms in the right place, but they're all things that would be there anyway. So it doesn't necessarily add a lot of cost to the building. The Greenie flat, for example, and remember this was 10 years ago, it cost $130,000 to build, and our entire running cost for the first year was $311. So it does work. And it gives you a lovely light-filled, in the wintertime, sunny, really nice space to be in the summertime, cool and shady. So it's a good way to go. There are some caveats to that. So it relies on having a good site with good solar access. Obviously, if you're surrounded by tall buildings or trees and the sun doesn't come in, then passive solar design is not going to work very effectively. It also depends on having thermal mass on the inside of the building, as I talked about before. And in the case of, say, a tiny home where it's on a trailer, then putting a lot of thermal mass inside of a tiny home is going to be very difficult. And it also relies on an active owner. There's an old saying, passive house, active owner. So, for example, in the Greenie flat, to get the best performance out of it, we have to do things like open the blinds during the day when the sun's coming in and close them at night to help keep the sun in, keep the heat in. Or in the summertime, maybe open the windows at night to cool the house down and then close things up during the day. So there is an element of needing to understand how to operate the house properly. And that doesn't always work. Say it's a rental property, for example, and you don't have control over how people are living in the house, and that could be a drawback with passive solar. Here's an example of a tiny home in a forest, which for two reasons wouldn't be a great setup for a passive solar house. Very difficult to get thermal mass and difficult to get much sun into the house. So this is where the Passivhaus Standard comes in, as a way of thinking about energy efficiency that doesn't necessarily rely on the sun coming into the building. So the Passivhaus Standard it's a German standard, hence the funny spelling, that is pretty much the most respected and effective energy efficiency standard for homes in the world. And it relies on exceptional insulation, exceptional windows, exceptional air sealing. They build passive houses super, super airtight and really, really well insulated. And then they require that you put in a heat recovery ventilation system. So for sites where, say, passive solar design might not work or might not be to your preference, then this is something that you might want to consider. There is a whole certification process that you can go through with Passivhaus, but you don't have to, but you can use the principles to give you, the benefits that are there. But if you want more information about that, there is a Passivhaus Association in Australia and website. They're easy to find, so that's something you might want to look into. And just one final note about tiny homes, and somebody asked me specifically to mention this. It's almost become a running joke about how tornadoes always hit trailer parks in America. We don't have tornadoes here, although there was one in Kiama a few years ago. But it is just something to think about if you are thinking about going down the tiny house route, is that they're not tied to the ground. And if you build a house in Australia, you have to tie it down from the foundations through every part of the building to the roof, and everything has to be tied to the ground. And in a tiny house, you don't have that. So depending on your site, if it's a really exposed site, this is something that could potentially happen. So something just to be aware of.